Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Page Turners Plus. The last time you saw us, we were reflecting on Ingrid Persaud's The Lost Love Songs of Boyise Singh. And at the end of that program, we promised you that we'll be having a conversation with Ingrid Persaud in our next episode. Today, we are joined by Ingrid Persaud to discuss her latest novel, The Lost Love Songs of Boyise Singh. Welcome, Ingrid.
Thank you so much for having me.
It is our pleasure. So, I want to start off the conversation by focusing on the main characters of the novel. So, you've constructed the novel from the perspective of four women in particular, and there was mention of the son, one of Boise's son. Were any of the characters based on real people connected to Boyise Singh?
Um, Boyise Singh was very real, and the characters in the book are people that I found around Boyise Singh. So I did a nonfiction piece on Boyise Singh, and in doing that research, I found that he had married, that he had a baby mother, that there was a sex worker who had possibly helped him, and so I had these glimpses of other people, but there was no information about them, and so yes, they are real people, but the lives that they have lived through my pages are imagined lives.
Yeah, I mean, I really enjoyed the novel to start off with. I was very hooked at the beginning, and I have many questions. I'm very disappointed I've only got a 40-minute slot to try and go through them as many as possible, but I'll go. And one of the questions I have is about Boysie himself. We don't actually learn about his life from him. We learn about it through the women that he loved, or that he had intimate relations with, or he had some relationship with in some form. Can you tell me why he took this approach? What do you think telling his story through the eyes of the women who were close to him kind of offered you as a writer and us as readers?
I felt that in terms of issues of justice, that it would be wrong to give him a voice. He's the one who's had the voice all along. And I felt it was time for him to shut up and to let other people tell the story, and to tell the story about how he affected them rather than what he did. The salacious details of his life are well known, and so there's nothing to be gained from going over that material, but there's so much to be gained by thinking about the impact of someone like that in your life. And I think that can speak to us now, as opposed to a rehashing of Boyise Singh as Boyise Singh.
I think I really felt that, like, that it was such a unique and very special way to kind of have this kind of very classic rags to riches gangster story told from these four women's perspectives, the women who kind of knew him best. So yeah, definitely really enjoyed that new way of looking at history. Thank you.
Thank you. The problem I think though is that a lot of people have focused on him as the gangster and the women as the chorus, and it was never meant to be like that. So that's been a little bit of the feedback I've had, and so I feel I've failed, to do what I set out to do.
No, I don't think you have, because what you get a really strong sense of is exactly what you said. Like, what would it mean to have Boysie Singh be in your life? Like, Manala is such an interesting character because on the surface, she's not especially sympathetic. She's quite simple in the sort of things that are important to her, and that's fair enough. But she kind of does herself damage at various points, if you like. But at the same time, you realise that she's very much in the grip of Boysie, and she's important to Boysie. I think Popo describes her house as his headquarters, and she has no sense of that level of importance that she must therefore have. And you don't always get a sense for quite a long time into the book that she senses how important Boysie is, because he's just the man that she loves, that she wants to do right by her. That's kind of the extent of her relationship with him. pretty much until very close to the end of the novel. And I think you see Boysie in particular levels of vulnerability with these different women at different times because of the way you've chosen to tell the story. So I don't think you failed at all. Actually, I think you've done a wonderful job of bringing a character like that to life through the eyes of the women who knew him, giving both of them and him a voice, because he still appears. It's still in lots of ways a story, but it's his story as you've never thought it could have been.
You're very kind. Manala was the most difficult to write, and she was most difficult to write because I had a lot of difficulty finding empathy for her, because her choices would never have been my choices, and also to write her with the appropriate amount of agency. And that was also difficult because I couldn't give her agency that she would not have had, given her circumstances and the time that she lived in, etc. So those are real handicaps. And it took many, many versions of Manala before I kind of found one that seemed to work.
This is not a two-person conversation, but I just want to come back and say one more thing. Was it possible to find out more about Manala through people that had known her, or had most of the people that had once known her passed away by the time you were doing your research and no one had previously done much work on her? Like, how did you reconstruct that character?
So no work has been done on the women, full stop. And what was also clear in trying to, since the archives did not give, as a historian, these written archives would be where I'd go to, and they didn't give the information. So I had to go to the informal archives, the gossip, the talk, the rumor, and even there was reluctance to kind of throw up information. And it was almost as if people felt that talking about Boysie was bringing bad spirit onto them. So, so long after his death, it's still taboo to kind of inquire into his life. And because, he was a mass murderer. There are not many people who are willing to talk about, their connection to him. So I was able to talk to his grandson, called Ashram, who's died in the last couple of years, and he was the only kind of family member who was really willing to be open and talk about his grandfather. But no relatives would come forward of the other women. So there's a lot of imagination.
Okay.
Eric, you must be dying to say something. The women have kind of dominated.
That's okay, and that's I think that's appropriate. But a similar question, but a little different here. Boysie and all of the female protagonists, other than Doris, had no real support network, or friends or family. Excuse me. They all, including Doris, after she marries Boysie, appear to have suffered from loneliness. And your protagonists in Love After Love, which I love that book, were also lonely. Do you intentionally create lonely characters? If so, why?
Gosh, Eric, you're never writing the book that you think you're writing. And I didn't know I was writing about loneliness in Love After Love, and I didn't know I was writing about loneliness in this book either. Which I think just makes me a terribly sad, lonely person who's probably just writing about her life. So I apologize for that. I must get out some more. But I think I honestly don't know. I don't set out. I really don't set out to write about loneliness. No.
Well, that's right. I mean, novels and characters go their own ways.
They go their own ways, you know, and these were women trying to have a relationship with a particularly strong person, and I think that inevitably isolates you. You know, to begin with. So there's a starting point of isolation, and then add that to my hermit personality, and you get this horrible, you know, mix.
Okay, and I do want to ask one follow up, and it relates to this larger question, especially with Doris. What I mean, did you intentionally have the marriage between Boysie and Doris unconsummated?
I know that was that took a that took a little bit of engineering. See, it's clear that Boysie had some sort of sexually transmitted disease, and he is living just before penicillin. And so it's very likely that he had syphilis, and it's very likely that it, you know, could account for his erratic behavior that, you know, as it spread through his body and possibly to his brain. And so it seemed to me that there was a goodly chance that he was not able to consummate the marriage. And the more I wrote the story, the more I thought, yeah, I like that. I like him
Okay.
being able to
Thank
do
you.
this.
All right. Thank
So
you.
that's just artistic license again.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
I mean, I want to pick up from there and focus on, I suppose, Boise's life before before venereal disease went to his brain. But you portrayed Boyise Singh as a sociopath, but also as a loving and devoted father. Why did you do that?
Because the evidence, unfortunately, says that he was probably a loving dad. And this is, so there's one book that's been written about Boysie by a journalist. And in it, most of the information in that book comes from the journalist talking to Chunksy, Boysie's son. And Chunksy speaks, you know, with such care about his father, and there's no rose-tinted view of his father, but he cites how much care he received, and I thought, you know, that can happen. The problem in writing is, how do I do that, you know? And so the first 600 drafts got it wrong, because, you know, it was like, it just didn't sit together, this sociopath and this loving father. And in the end, I just kind of had to keep juggling until I felt, you know, I had some sort of balance that was credible. And that's the problem, you know, books need to be credible, but human nature isn't necessarily so. So we're always writing some better version of ourselves into novels.
I don't know. I think there's plenty of examples of history of people that were loving and kind to the people that they cared about, and were absolutely wicked to people that they didn't believe were human or just didn't like them. You know, I think it makes the story more compelling because he does seem fully human, right? I think what's kind of interesting about Boysie in the way that you depict him is that he's very hands-on as a father, right? He doesn't just kind of turn up and give Chunksy hugs every now and again, or have a few magic memories. He's really invested in having him around as much as possible. I'm going to ask a follow-up question that's kind of the same in some ways, but do you think he was a good father? And in the fullness of that word, right? Because is it good to kind of get your son into the life of crime that you had? Or is it that, you know, like however you take that, what does that mean in the case of Boyise Singh? Was he a good father?
So I'm a parent of twin boys, and I struggle with parenting. I think it's one of the most challenging roles that I have in my life, and they're 24, and it continues to be challenging. So and I'm not a sociopath, so God knows how it goes when you are one as well. I think he was a good enough father. He clearly, this was an outlet for all the love that he couldn't otherwise feel, or allow himself to feel. And, I'm not a sociologist or a psychologist, but there is a mother very much missing from his life, that kind of maternal figure. And so why wouldn't he want to love this thing that was part of him as much as he possibly could? I think it was a safe place for him to love.
Okay. I want to shift gears somewhat and get into something that I actually was interested in. And there's a suggestion in the text that Boysie rejected many parts of what we'll call Indian Trinidadian culture. We see it in the early part of the novel, especially after the birth of Chonksi. And he embraced African Trinidadian culture. Was this part of him from what you gathered, or was this something that you imagined? Was it something contextual? Because he grew up in Port of Spain, which is infused mostly with that African Trinidadian culture. So could you just explain
Sure.
your choice in that?
I leaned heavily on the research done by Professor Ken Ramchand in this area. And his contention is that Boysie was a Port of Spain Indian, which was a particular type of person. And a Port of Spain Indian without an Indian network around him inevitably became and took part in the activities of his peers. So he would take on the religion, the ceremonies, etc. But what's interesting about, I think, Boysie's trajectory is that he understood the value of these cultural aspects, the political, cultural aspects of taking on, for example, the Catholic religion as opposed to the Hindu religion. He understood this as a stepping stone in society. So there's a lot of kind of class associated with his choices as well. And he was not part of the plantation culture. And I also find it interesting that often at the moments of births and deaths, etc., it's when we think most about our cultural heritage. And he died a Catholic. He absolutely, that was his wish. So he is baptized the night before he's executed, and his descendants are all, very strong Catholics, with both a Catholic name and an Indian name, just in proper Trini style.
Okay. One follow up to that, and again, this is according to my experiences on the ground in Trinidad. That's maybe the second time. Yeah, my second visit to Trinidad. I actually went to mass. I grew up Baptist. I'm Protestant,
Right.
but I grew up in a Catholic city, New Orleans. And one thing that struck me at going to mass in Port of Spain was that it seemed like the entirety of the demographics showed up at mass on Sunday morning, and it was a beautiful thing to see. So I think this is your point about Boise growing up in Port of Spain. Is this necessarily accurate in terms of explaining all of Port of Spain, and that whether you have African descent, South Asian descent, East Asian descent, uh, are people in Port of Spain drawn to these institutions like the Roman Catholic Church?
So, Eric, I assume your visit was within the last decade or so. Yeah. So if we go back to the time I'm writing about in the 1940s and 50s, those attending the Catholic Church, the demographic was very, very different. It would have been the French Creole class,
Mm-hmm.
and it would have been sort of the people that they educated. So, you know, in order to access education through the Catholic Church, you had to, the Catholic schools, you had to convert. So there were those who were converted. So it was it was a very elitist audience, and a very privileged audience to which Boysie aspired. There were very, very few East Indians who would have been Roman Catholic. And you were in Port of Spain. I grew up in San Fernando, and I went to schools set up by the Canadian Presbyterian missionaries. And those are almost, you know, the demographic there is it's all Indo-Caribbean. I mean, 95% Indo-Caribbean. And so, and it remained so. And so you see both a race difference and less so of a class difference, but there's certainly still an undertone of class, that the children of East Indian origin would have come from the countryside, or their parents would have been in business rather than in politics, or well, now they're in the profession. So, but you take my point. It's not, I think you saw a wonderful coming together of the society, but I beg to differ that it wasn't like that in the time of Boise's
Okay. And I think this actually goes back to a point that I've made in the previous discussion on the novel, that for me, looking at it from a historian's point of view, that Boysie represented an emerging, I would say, an emerging Trinidadian culture where Africans and South Asians are beginning to come together, especially in Port of Spain. And there's more of a Trinidadian culture that's emerging. That's how I saw it. I don't know if that was the case in the 1930s, 1940s.
I think it's a bit early to talk about that. I think that comes much later in the 1960s. But that's you know, I love that you see that. I mean, I grew up in a far more integrated society, so my writing, you know, kind of has that influence in it. So if I can see ways of hinting at that, I probably would unconsciously do it. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
So I actually wanted to continue in terms of Boise's relationship with his Indian heritage. And so there are several mentions throughout the novel of Boise's uneasy relationship with the sword. So is it that his relationship with the sword, or the mentions of the sword, a proxy for his uneasy relationship with his father and his Indian heritage? Or is the sword just a literary device or part of the history or folklore surrounding Boyise Singh?
Gosh, you know, my readers are clearly far more intellectual than I am. The sword's a sword, and it's actually just like a literal sword, right? So in the research, I found out that, Bagram Singh, Boyse's dad, had come across and from India, and he as a Sikh, he was allowed to have his ceremonial kirpal, and that's how he brings the sword over, and this sword passes through the generations, and it was in the hands of Ashram Joseph, the grandson, who I interviewed. And it was the time of COVID, and I couldn't get to Trinidad. Trinidad opened very, very late. And so it was by Zoom that we did this interview. And he was a notoriously kind of volatile character. And I don't know any other researcher who actually was able to interview Ashram. So I feel I've got one up there. I managed to interview him, and it was an entirely safe proposition because it was Zoom. But anyway, he really got into the chat, and he asked me if I'd like to see the sword, and I was like, wow. Sure. So the sword comes out, and he brings it, and it's, he takes it out of the sheath, and he I'm screenshotting, like mad, and I can't believe I'm seeing the sword, and the sword, has this it's supposed to be a hawk on the handle with a red stone, and it looks like a strangled chicken, and and the leather sheath is half gone, and I ask him where he keeps the sword, and he's like, well, sometimes it does be under the bed, sometimes it does be on top the wardrobe, and I just give it money and thing, and keep it good. And I'm like, oh, I can't believe, this is like gold dust, and so the sword was very real. And in some draft of the novel, I got so excited about this sword that the sword was all over the book. I mean, I was just writing my version of Lord of the Rings, and I had to, my editor had to like claw back and say, Ingrid, that's another book, and please feel free to go and write that book, but this one you're writing, the sword really doesn't feature that much. And so I have all this kind of material I've written about the sword. And, someday I will go back and maybe write a short story or who knows what with the sword. But I was mesmerized by the sword. And I'll say this publicly, in case anyone's listening who has access, I would love to have the sword. I would love to acquire the sword, maybe to enjoy it for a little while on my own, but I think it belongs in our National Museum. But people have very mixed feelings about artifacts that belong to notorious characters. So I don't know, but it just seems to me that it hidden by one of the remaining siblings and never kind of being discussed is a bit sad. It's a bit of a loss. But there were lots of times I was like, I want the sword. I want the sword. I need the sword. I can't write this novel until I've got the sword. And my mother said to me, you're afraid to have that sword around you. And I'm like, no, I need the sword. Anyway, the book got written, despite not having the sword.
And the sword isn't the sword. It's not the 3 threes, is it? It's 3 threes is the main equipment that we need.
The 3 threes is a pui stick that has been blessed by an Orisha goddess. So it's a hardwood stick, and stick fighting was also something that Boysie was excelled at. And that was his weapon of choice.
That's right.
Not the sword.
Oh, interesting.
I would have pulled that sword for sure.
Mm.
This is a really nice segue though, because my question actually was sort of one of the things that I was delighted in was that some of the stories, particularly around the doctor's tenants or the story of the older lady who moves in, were actually true stories recounted by people who had known Boysie, who'd been his neighbours. And I wondered, how did you choose like what to fictionalize and what truths or facts that were, or folklore, to exclude and what to include when you were writing the novel? How did you construct your narrative?
It's kind of a process of gaining confidence. And I think, you know, when I first started to write it, I was very worried about people who were alive or their descendants. And as I wrote, and as no one came forth with information, I got more and more confidence that I'm writing my story. This is my story. This is my version of events. I'm not trying to write their story. I'm not being a biographer. I'm not a historian. I am writing a piece of fiction. And as I got that confidence that this was a work of fiction, that I could do whatever I liked with it, I think it freed me up to decide which things suited the story, which things worked. Did recounting this particular story take the plot further or not? So it took a long time to think like a fiction writer when I was writing this, because I was hampered by notions of what was my ethical obligation, until I felt that my ethical obligation was quite negligible. That's terrible to say, but I'm not writing history. It's not a history book.
It isn't a history book, but it is historical fiction, right? You're bringing to life an era that current people reading it most won't have experienced. So I'm not pushing on the ethical obligation at all. But one of the things that we did discuss, and we had different views on it. I'm sorry, I always have a follow-up question. And I was really struck by how this kind of period, which is sort of the 25, 30 years before Trinidad becomes independent, a lot of the kind of classic, shall we say, historical markers aren't present in your novel. And I wondered if that was intentional, that we don't hear about 1937, or we don't hear about the Federation, or the Federation's after, but it's coming, right? That the World War II, we only get it through the perspective of the Limeys who have arrived and the changes that they bring. Is that kind of a deliberate choice, or do you think that your characters would have been more oblivious to them, or not oblivious isn't the right word, unaffected? No. I don't know. Like, you get the question.
Absolutely, I totally get it, and you see, those were my interests. Politics is my interest, but politics wasn't those women's interests, and therefore it could not feature. I would be, kind of shoving it onto it, and it would inevitably sit uneasily among the things. And I didn't want to do that. I had to stick with things that felt real to the women and their quotidian lives. And Federation didn't matter to them. And the wonderful, kind of oratory of union leaders rising, etc., did not belong to their lives. And so I couldn't put them in. And putting them in was just would have been an indulgence. And so I had to recreate the era in terms of those details which would have mattered to them. Transport, lighting, clothing, shopping. Those were the things that mattered to them, rather than these much larger scale events. And as a kind of follow-up to your question, it's also, I am writing historical fiction, and so my duty is to get the era right in some way, to invoke it in some sort of authentic way. And once I do that, I think my duty is discharged. But perhaps, that's for another discussion between the two of us over coffee.
And on the sorry, Eric, I just wanted to get in here because on the flip side of Kesua's question is the fact that, well, we've reflected on Kevin Jared Hussein's Hungry Ghost before, and we sort of mentioned how he quite brilliantly integrates, rural Indian culture, particularly in central and heading towards South Trinidad. So I think you also filled in the gaps in representing that while Trinidad might be a blob on the map, it's quite a multicultural, multidimensional society where, on one hand, in Hungry Ghost, you get the view of the early 20th century Indian descendants living in rural Trinidad, having a very rural life, faced with extreme poverty. And on the other hand, you get Boyise Singh, an Indian descendant, living in Port of Spain, having a very sort of urban, suburban life in Trinidad. So you do get the flip side of the coin. And I think that's a strong purpose of historical fiction. You give us same period, but very different activities happening in the same Trinidad. So I think that helped.
Also, I think I will always write about Trinidad, and maybe not exclusively so, but I think that one doesn't need to travel far to tell human stories, and so everything is there. It's a small island, but it's all there, and I don't need more exotic or urban locations. I don't need to place my stories in New York to make them, real.
That's an excellent point. I I do want to shift a little bit and ask a question about the supernatural.
Okay.
So the supernatural is a daily presence in the reality of life of the characters in the novel, whether they fear and reject characters like Mother Gazad or Doris does, um, as Doris does. I'm sorry, um, or actively seek them out as Manala and Boysie do, or are endorsed or endowed with supernatural gifts like Rosie. Yet I've not seen it described as a magical, realist piece of historical fiction. Is that a description you necessarily use for the novel?
I'd be delighted if anyone used that description of the novel, because I had so much fun incorporating the supernatural into it. And, without giving away the end, I one character totally embodies the transformation of the spirit. And as you said, Eric, it's part of our lives, and what I've wanted to do in this book and my first novel is to privilege the importance of it, and to recognize it with respect, because for too long it's considered a second tier of spirituality, below the established religions. And I kind of wanted to say, no, actually, this is our spirituality. We might go to church, but we also have all these other things. And, when you go to a church and you go to the altar to worship, it is the same process that is happening with Mother Gizzard, preparing a space in which she creates her potions that she gives. Her conversations with Manala are so similar to the confessions that others may go to in a more structured religion. And so I wanted to show that that our spirituality is alive, very real. It's got structure. It's got real depth to it, and it is not to be dismissed.
Okay, good. Yeah, I appreciated that part of the process and what you show, because it does decolonize our knowledge.
And our historical fiction.
Yes. And I also, I also chose an Indian kind of a mythological figure who, when the Sapan, which is related to Rosie's character, is portrayed as this terrible woman, because she's a strong woman who can turn into a snake, and heaven forbid she can have up to 7 lovers. And I thought, oh yeah, I'm gonna have a polyamorous badass protagonist in this, and so I had lots of fun, just kind of taking the shame away from how these characters are written about.
I guess this is probably going to be my final question, actually, but I was really curious about the structure of the novel, because right at the beginning, we discover that Boysie, the title is his name, he's actually going to be held to account for the crimes that he's committed, or for the life of terror that he's led. And why did you reveal that like super early on in the novel? Like and did you anticipate the kind of impact that might have on readers and how they engaged with the story, whether or not they'd heard of Boyise Singh before picking up your novel?
Because you can Google Boyise Singh, and the Wikipedia entry, which is not entirely accurate, comes up straight away. I thought, there's no murder mystery here. We know what he did, and we can find out about his life very quickly. So I'm just going to put that out there, and we're going to work from that premise. So I kind of liked just, getting rid of any notions that did he not, was he not. The guy was a bad one, right? So let's just get rid of that notion. And then so there's this fictional piece of a newspaper article, and it is fiction. Some readers thought that it was actually taken from a newspaper, whereas the reporter is a mixture of the names of 2 of my friends and their dog. It's like it's entirely made up, right? But it contains facts. It contains those facts that I could find. It's the right day, it's the right sequence of events, etc. And then there's one piece where, just for a few pages, you see Boysie before any of this happened. And so I thought, there's this moment where you can take a breath before we plunge into the story, and then it takes off in a kind of Quentin Tarantino sort of moment of blood everywhere. So yeah, that's. But of course, the structure comes from making lots of errors, and inevitably, I try different ways, and you end up with something that you can live with.
So we're almost out of time, but I usually like to end the program with a bit of spice and controversy, right? So I had my own thoughts and version of it last week, but maybe this is for confirmation. So Boysie, as you imagine him, would never have progressed beyond petty criminality without the intervention of Popo, Doris, and even Manala. You mentioned earlier in our conversation that Rosie was entirely made up. I think it was Rosie, yes. So who would you say Boysie loved the most? Even, in your own fictional retelling of the story, who do you think Boysie loved the most?
Well, he only loved Chunksy and himself. I don't know that, what version of love we could say that he had for the women. It's the power dynamic is such that there was no match ever. Maybe a little bit with Doris, but it certainly wouldn't be any kind of love that I'd like to experience. So no, I don't think he loved anybody.
That answer was totally unexpected, but I actually actually appreciate that answer.
Okay, so
I expected it. I expected that answer.
Okay, but you thought he loved someone. So tell me who you thought he loved.
I mean, in spite of the circumstances, without revealing too much of what happened in the end, I thought it was Popo. I thought
no way. I mean,
yes.
what he did to her with that.
Oh
no, we
forgetting that bit.
Another discussion off camera about your ideas of love, honey. Because that, I mean, if you know, that cannot be it. But I mean, I think about it. I guess if you've got to go down one route, it would probably be Doris. I mean, there was a certain amount of adoration of Doris, and a certain amount of kind of wishing that he could have been the kind of man to live a life with Doris. So, I'd say she would be the best contender.
Although, as you say, like, he wanted to be loved by Boyise Singh. Like, none of the women he loved escaped his lash or his ire. So, like, it was very much a poison chalice.
Yes.
Yeah. And I think
what are we to end?
It's so powerful, right? Because it's like, so he can love. He just does not love in a way that we would recognize anyway.
Yes. So what are we to end? Thank you for contributing to my usual controversy, Ingrid. So this was quite a lovely program. To let our readers know, the next time you see us, we'll be reflecting on Barbara Jenkins' The Writer's Place. But before we go, we have for you a reading from Ingrid Persaud. Thank you for joining us.
I'm going to read from The Lost Love Songs of Boyise Singh, which is a book written in 4 voices, 4 women, Manala, Doris, Rosie, and Popo. And they are all women in Boyise Singh's life. And I'm going to read the first chapter of the book, which is in Rosie's voice. Rosie. While the shop ain't busy, I told myself, Rosie girl, drink a cup of coffee, tea, and check the papers. Nobody's coming for a shot of rum this hour, and on the dry goods side is always one person throughout the day. I ain't sit down good when I spotted the wretch. Man dead and he's still making front page. And look at that. Boysie playing innocent down to the end. Exactly who that Bajon think he fooling? At least now he's in the ground, we might get an ease from seeing him all the time. Something else will take over the news. Every night the Lord seen me on my knees begging that boy doesn't fill the gap he's left. They say goat don't make sheep. Well, this is one time I hope they're wrong, yes? A sudden hard rain made me put down the papers. 2 school children, a girl about 7 and a boy child a little younger, rushed to shelter under the shop awning. The way she held on to the boy, I could tell she was a good big sister. I called to them, "Come inside and don't get wet. You see how the sun's still shining? Rain go past now for now." They came and stood by the door. I smiled. Come in, I don't bite." The girl pulled her brother where they were safe from the pelting rain. "You know that when sun's shining and rain falling, monkey does be marrying. Either that or the devil and his wife fighting." Poor children looked at me like they thought I was about to gobble them up. A good 5 minutes hadn't passed, and rain stopped just so. The 2 bolted. I watched them speed off, holding hands tight. Steam rose from the hot pitch, releasing a sickly sweet smell that made me feel slightly nauseous. Then something happened. Maybe it was the pitch smell, or the little boy and girl holding hands, or just reading the death notice? Could be all three. Suddenly I realized what was bothering my head. I was thinking of Boysie. What's that game children play? The one with two circles, holding hands and singing in turns. Ah, yes. In a fine castle, do you hear my CCO? In a fine castle, do you hear my CCO? Without missing a beat, the second circle would reply. Ours is the prettiest, do you hear my CCO? Ours is the prettiest, do you hear my CCO? What song did we throw back? Ah, yes. We want one of them, do you hear my CCO? We want one of them, do you hear my CCO? From the side, under a laden guava tree, a boy, had to be less than 10, was watching us playing in the road. Our eyes made four. Without words, he knew that we coolie orphans, holding hands while singing louder and louder, had room for other unclaimed children. Which of us do you want? Do you hear my CCO? I broke hands mid-song so he could join my circle. He came forward slowly and gave me his hand. That little hand squeezed mine just a bit tighter than the others. I squeezed back. Which of us do you want? Do you hear my CCO? A scared boy, out on the road by himself, nobody looking to see what he was doing. That barefoot, raggedy child grew into John Boyise Singh, the Raja. How that happened?